So Article 6 is an article from the Paris Agreement, which establishes market mechanisms. So these market mechanisms are systems which allow countries or other stakeholders, like companies, for example, to buy and sell carbon emissions or emission reductions. Under the Paris Agreement and in the UNFCCC framework, the main idea is to allow countries to exchange emission reductions, and this will allow them to then use these credits, use these emission reductions to meet their climate targets. They could also be purchasing carbon credits as a way of channeling finance to specific countries if they, for example, decide to buy carbon credits and don't use them to meet their climate targets. But essentially, Article 6 is a set of two markets which will govern how countries can exchange emission reductions. And then there will need to be, it will include, for example, accounting rules, safeguards on how to involve local people, and generally how to fit in this idea of trading emission reductions within the broader prospects and context of climate negotiations. So I guess the main the first main market that was established was under the Kyoto Protocol, so the precursor to the Paris Agreement. Under the Kyoto Protocol, mostly rich countries had climate targets, and there were three different types of carbon markets that were established. And one of them, the Clean Development Mechanism, often called the CDM for its acronym, has been much discussed and continues to be discussed quite a lot under the Paris Agreement. And the idea there was to allow those countries that did have a climate target under the Kyoto Protocol to purchase emission reductions from countries that did not have a climate target under the Kyoto Protocol. And most of these countries were developing countries, the countries that did not have climate targets. And so the idea was to make sure that developed countries still finance emission reductions in countries that don't yet have a target, and then use these reductions to meet their own objectives. That was one of the most well-known markets established under the UNFCCC until now, and one of the big negotiation discussions under Article 6 now and under the Paris Agreement is also to decide what will happen to the CDM, because it's a system that continues to exist, and there are many projects registered and many credits that have been generated. And so the question is, can you meet your new climate targets under the Paris Agreement with all the emission reductions that were generated under the Kyoto Protocol? And there has been quite a lot of criticism as well of the CDM. So there are some benefits of transferring technology, for example, or identifying better rules to measure and monitor emission reductions. At the same time, a significant share of the credits that were traded and exchanged under the CDM did not represent the full tons of CO2 that they were supposed to represent. And so this created a problem under the negotiations, because you want to make sure that when you use carbon credits, they really represent emission reductions. Otherwise, when you use them to meet your own climate targets, you cannot really be sure that you are reaching the climate benefits and reaching the climate goals that you set for yourself. Because when you think you're paying for a ton of CO2 that has been reduced, actually maybe it's less than that, and so it becomes very difficult to do the accounting. And so that's been one of the main markets we've had until now. And in a way, the Article 6 is a succession, is a follow-up system on the markets that were established under the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, with the transition from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, there are a lot of changes. I think we can say we're in quite a different world now. One of the main important changes is the fact that all countries now have climate targets, or nearly all countries. And so the logic that I just described, which was underpinning the CDM and the main carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol, which was to have those countries with climate targets to pay for emission reductions in countries that do not have climate targets. That logic is no longer applicable under the Paris Agreement because every country has a target. And so one of the big implications of that, and one of the big changes, is that now when countries trade emission reductions, they need to make sure that these emission reductions will only be accounted for once. So if you have a country that sells a ton of CO2 reduced, then that country cannot at the same time count that reduction towards its own objective. And that's, of course, a new problem under the Paris Agreement, where every country has a target, which was not a problem under the Kyoto Protocol, since at the time some countries didn't have a target. And so when they sold the credit, there was no risk of them counting it towards their own objective because they didn't have an objective. And that's been one of the main evolutions between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and one that is creating one of the difficult points of negotiation under Article 6 at the moment. So there are very many points being discussed in Article 6, and so I'm definitely not going to go over all of them. And setting up a market is also quite a technical task. And so many of the issues being negotiated are quite technical and relate to accounting measures and how to make sense of a global system of trading CO2. But I think some issues are clearly the key elements of the negotiation. There is one of them is the problem of double counting, which I just referred to. So it's this idea of making sure that with countries all having a target, you need to avoid that a country counts a reduction if it has already been sold. And so countries are discussing and negotiating how to do that. And trying to come up with a joint accounting system to make sure that this will not happen. A second big issue is to decide what will happen to the CDM, so the carbon market established under the Kyoto Protocol, and how to deal with the large number of credits that are already available on the market. So can countries use these credits to meet their objective under the Paris Agreement or not? Or should there be some limits and some form of compromise in the middle? And also, how do you deal with all the different projects that were registered under that system? Because of course the emission reductions come from somewhere. They come from specific projects which have been approved and registered under the CDM. And so there is a question of what happens to these projects and should they get transitioned to the new market mechanisms, to Article 6. And this is also being negotiated right now. And then maybe a few other issues without going into too much detail. There are discussions around how to make sure that markets can truly deliver an overall reduction in emissions. So going beyond the idea of zero-sum offsetting, because of course, if you reduce your emissions somewhere and you use it to compensate an emission somewhere else, then the end result is a zero-sum game where you have done +1 somewhere, -1 somewhere else, and you're at zero. Whereas we want to reduce emissions overall, and so there are discussions on how to make that a reality, how to operationalize that principle. And then finally, another aspect which I think is very important is how to make sure that these systems not only reduce emissions, but also truly benefit people and the environment. We have seen in the past that some projects did have some negative impacts on local communities and on indigenous peoples, as well as sometimes negative impacts on the environment. And of course, that's not what we want. There's no there's no point really in reducing emissions if the cost is to harm local communities through those projects. And so as part of the Article 6 negotiations, one of the important elements that needs to be agreed is to have safeguards in place. These can be, for example, having a grievance mechanism, so a way for stakeholders to kind of register complaints if there are projects that harm them, or also rules on consulting local stakeholders, so making sure that everyone has a voice when there is a project that is about to get implemented, that anyone can give their opinion and explain how this project might affect them, so that this opinion can then be taken into account when the project gets implemented. So these are a handful of the issues that are being negotiated. Well, Article 6 is a really tricky part of the Paris Agreement to be negotiated. It's been now, over 5 years, over 6 years actually, that the Paris Agreement has been adopted, and we still don't have rules for Article 6. It's one of the 3 remaining issues that still need an agreement at the UNFCCC, and possibly the largest for now. It is both very technical and very political, since, as I mentioned, there are quite detailed accounting rules and other measures that need to be adopted, and these require some level of expertise. At the same time, decisions are also highly political. For example, if you think about whether or not it's acceptable to meet new climate targets with old emission reductions. So if it's okay to meet Paris Agreement targets with credits from the CDM, from the Kyoto Protocol, there are some technical elements to it, but mainly this is a political decision. And so that makes the negotiations very tricky, because you need a combination of good technical expertise and high-level political involvement. And since negotiations have been going on for several years now, many of the technical issues have been debated at length. And clearly what is needed now is to have perhaps higher level political outreach and involvement in order to reach an agreement. At the same time, I think from a climate point of view, we need to keep in mind that the objective needs to remain reducing emissions, and therefore establishing markets could play a role in this, but the objective is not to establish markets for the sake of establishing markets. So we need to make sure that all the loopholes and all the possible risks are closed, and not necessarily have a political deal at any cost. Yeah, so I think it's definitely an interesting topic to look at Article 6 and carbon market mechanisms in general. Article 6 is a compliance system, so this means it's a system meant for reaching mandatory targets or targets set by governments. At the same time, we're seeing today a very strong increase in interest from the private sector and I guess to some extent from the general public as well, for carbon credits and offsets. There is definitely a lot of interest in net zero claims. So we're seeing more and more companies come out with net zero targets, whether it's, for example, Microsoft or Shell, or lots of companies around the world are coming up with these targets. And so it's important to keep a critical mind, a critical mindset on these, and try to understand what is a carbon credit, what is an offset, what does carbon neutrality mean, and so in the context of the Article 6 negotiations, it's important to keep in mind that a carbon credit is supposed to represent a full ton of CO2 that has been avoided or reduced, and it's not the same thing as reducing your own emissions for a company. And so reaching zero emissions for a company is not the same thing as purchasing carbon offsets and reaching net zero. So you need to make sure that the credits that are purchased really represent the emissions that they are supposed to represent. But first and foremost, you also need to make sure that whoever buys carbon offsets, whether it's you as an individual or a private company or a government, using carbon offsets is always a last resort. And this is not a way, it's not a system to kind of keep business as usual and continue living the way we do. It's rather a potential short-term escape to deal with unabatable emissions, so a small share of emissions we absolutely cannot reduce. But it's really important to keep that in mind, that offsetting is not kind of get out of jail free card, but it's really a system that might be useful, but that needs to be considered in the broader context of needing to reduce your own emissions as a priority.